הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב, הנה מה טוב. יאללה לה, יאללה לה 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 לה. הנה מה טוב, הנה מה טוב. יאללה לה, יאללה לה 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 לה. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד. Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to Congregation Ormi, especially if it's your first time here ever or just in a long while. So we're very glad to have you here with us tonight as we celebrate Shabbat. And we'd like to offer a very special welcome to our guest speaker who will be talking about 30-ish minutes. Thank you for being here, Dr. Kravitz. So we begin our service together on page 1 where it says pieces coming together. And let's read in English. One part of Judaism is called Tikkun Olam. It says that the world has been broken into pieces, all this chaos, all this discord. And our job, everyone's job, is to try to put the pieces back together, to make things whole again. Maybe we're the pieces. Maybe what we're supposed to do is come together. That's how we end the brokenness. And I'd like to invite up Ron to light our Shabbat candles this week. You can find the blessing on the bottom of page 3. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel Shabbat. Thank you, Ron. And at this point in our service, we think of the week that has passed, and we hold on to whatever good things we experienced in this past week. I know it's a rough week for many, but if you had a moment that inspired gratitude, if you have any good news to share, no matter how big or how small, I invite you to share that joy with the community now. Yeah, Susan? Awesome. Making good progress. And Ed?
I participated in Jewish Lobby Day on Wednesday and got to speak with 3 delegates about bills that are relevant to the Jewish community. Even got press ganged into being one of the people who spoke on the bills.
Good, good. Thanks for representing Orami. Yeah.
One of my friends in the shop got his Virginia State Inspector's license.
Mazel tov. Awesome achievement. So we thank God for all these blessings, including the blessing of simply being alive for this moment in time, with the words of Shehechianu, found at the bottom of page 4. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shehechianu v'kimanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shehechianu v'kimanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. We continue together at the bottom of page 5 with the importance of action, reading responsively. Be wise not only in words, but also in deeds. Mere knowledge is not the goal, but rather action. Say little and do much, for by your deeds shall you be judged. So we continue with an abbreviated version of Lechado D, which you can find on page 8. We'll be singing the last line and the first 2 lines. Boikala, 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 boikala. Boikala, 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 boikala. Lechado di, likrat kala, pene Shabbat nekabela. Boikala, 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 boikala. Boikala, 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 boikala. Boikala, boikala. And continue with the quote, the top of page 9, a single moment. How wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world. Please rise for our official call to worship, the Baruch Hu, in the middle of page 9. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Barechu et Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai HaMevorach, HaMevorach leolam va'ed. HaMevorach, HaMevorach leolam va'ed. Please be seated. We continue with Roll into Dark at the bottom of the page. Roll into dark, roll into light. Night becomes day, day turns to night. Roll into dark, roll into light. Night becomes day, day turns to night. Borei yom v'layla, golel or mipnei choshech. Golel or mipnei choshech, vechoshech mipnei or. Roll into dark, roll into light. Night becomes day, day turns to night. Roll into dark, roll into light. Night becomes day, day turns to night. And we continue in the middle of page 10 with We Believe. We believe in tomorrow. We believe that poverty need not be permanent and that we need not learn war forever. We believe that there can yet be a time of peace, of justice, and of love for all who live on earth. Let people everywhere be sure that every deed counts, that every word has power. In spite of all its absurdities and frustrations and disappointments. And please rise in body or in spirit for the most important prayer in our tradition, the Shema, at the bottom of page 10. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. 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 Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Please be seated. On the top of page 11. V'yahavta et Adonai Elohecha bechol levavcha uvechol nafshecha uvechol me'odecha v'hayu hadvarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al levavecha v'shinatam levanecha v'dibarta bam b'shivtecha b'veitecha u'v'lechtecha v'derech u'v'shochbecha u'v'kumecha u'kshartam leot al yadecha v'hayu letotafot b'neinecha u'chtavtam al mezuzot beitecha u'visharecha leman tizkeru v'asitem et kol mitzvotai v'item kadoshim le'elohechem ani Adonai Elohechem asher hotzeiti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim liot lachem le'elohim Ani Adonai Elohechem. We continue at the bottom of page 12 with the responsive reading, Let Us Act. When evil darkens our world, let us be bearers of light. When fists are clenched in self-righteous rage, let our hands be open for the sake of peace. When injustice slams the doors on the ill, the poor, the old, and the stranger, let us pry the doors open. Where shelter is lacking, let us be builders. Where food and clothing are needed, let us be providers. Where knowledge is denied, let us be champions of learning. When dissent is stifled, let our voices speak truth to power. When the earth and its creatures are threatened, let us be their guardians. When bias, greed, and bigotry erode our country's values, let us proclaim liberty throughout the land. In places where no one acts like a human being, let us bring courage, let us bring compassion, let us bring humanity. We continue with Micha Mocha at the bottom of page 14. Yai lai 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 yai la 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 ya la la yai מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נדר בקודש, נורא תהילתו ספלה, נורא תהילתו ספלה. We continue in the middle of page 15 with Vishamru. Vishamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם, אותי לעולם. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. וביום השביעי שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. We continue on page 16 with the reflection at the top of the page. Pray as if everything depends on God, but act as if everything depends on you. Those who rise from prayer better persons, their prayers are answered. Please rise for our central prayer, the Amidah. Adonai sefatai tiftach ufi agi tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips, that my mouth may declare your glory. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu v'imotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, v'Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Leah, v'Elohei Rachel, Ha'el Hagadol, Hagibor v'Hanura, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, V'Konei Hakol, V'Zocher Chasdei Avot v'Imahot, U'Mevi Geula Lifnei V'neihem, L'ma'an Shemo Be'ahava, Melech Ozer U'Moshiach U'Magen. Baruch atah Adonai, Magen Avraham v'Ezrat Sarah. Atah Gibor Le'olam Adonai, Mechayei Hakol, Atah Rav Lehoshia. Mechalkel Chaim Bechesed, Mechayei Hakol Berachamim Rabim. Somech noflim v'rofeh cholim, umatir asurim, umekayem emunato, lishenei afar, michamocha ba'al gevurot, umidom elach, melech memit umechaye וישועה, ונאמן אתה לחיות הכל. Baruch atah Adonai mechayei hakol. Please be seated. We continue with a quiet moment for personal prayer or reflection. Page 18. Let's. Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Ki ata hu melech Adon lechol hashalom. Ki ata hu melech Adon lechol hashalom. Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. V'tov be'einecha levarech et amcha Yisrael bechol eit uvechol shah bishlomecha. Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Tasim Leolam. Tasim Leolam. At this point in our service, we think of loved ones who are in need of healing. Tonight, we think especially of Stan Foyer, Maggie Foote, Alyssa Freeman, Jeff Haken, Art Matz, Jonathan Prupis-Kern, Alex Simon, and Lori Weinberg. Are there other loved ones whose healing we wish to pray for tonight? With the power of community, we pray for their refuah shlema, their complete healing of body and or spirit. The words of Misha Berach found at the bottom of page 20. Misha Berach avotenu mikor habracha leimotenu. May the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Misha Berach imotenu mikor habracha leavotenu. Bless the with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal spirit, and let us say, Amen. So I'd like to invite up Lisa to share some brief announcements on behalf of the board.
Shabbat Shalom. Tomorrow morning, Torah study and brunch at 11 a.m. Monday, February 3rd, is the Orami Book Club at 7 p.m. That's in person and Zoom. And the book is Shakespeare's Kitchen, Short Stories by Laurie Siegel. Let's see what else. Sunday, February 9th, there's a Tu B'Shvat Seder at 11 a.m. And Ed Kaufman could use some more people to help set up and clean up.
Volunteer, or maybe 3 sets of volunteers. I'll need volunteers on Saturday around 12:30, 1 o'clock to set up tables. And then I'll also need some volunteers Sunday before the Tu B'Shvat Seder to set up the fruit and the plate for the Seder. And then obviously help cleaning up. So if anyone's
Okay.
willing to volunteer and is here, come see me after the service.
And the same day, Sunday, February 9th, there is the RISC Network meeting at 4 p.m. at the Breslow Moses house. 12:30. Oh, we got the wrong time on here. At 12:30. So right after the Seder. Okay. Okay. Shabbat Shalom.
And one more thing, you may have received an email recently with a survey. If you feel passionately about the starting time of our services and you haven't filled out the survey yet, please fill it out. The survey is mostly about adding family services and what time those should be, but that could also affect other Friday nights. So please share if you have an opinion, and if you don't care about any time, you'll always show up for Shabbat, then feel free to fill it out anyway, but we want to hear from those who are passionate about the timing. As we continue our service together on page 22 with Aleinu, please rise for the Aleinu prayer. Aleinu leshabeach ladon hakol, latet grula leotze breshit, shelo asanu kegoye haratzot, velo samanu kemishpachot adama, shelo sam chelkenu kahem, vegor aleinu kechol hamonam, va'anachnu korim, umishtachavim umodim, lifnei melech malchei hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, v'ne'emar, v'haya Adonai, lemelech al kol haaretz, bayom ha'hu, yiyeh Adonai echad, u'shemo, continue in the middle of page 23. There are stars. There are stars up above, so far away, we only see their light long, long after the star itself is gone. And so it is with people we loved. Their memories keep shining ever brightly, though their time with us is done. But the stars that light up the darkest night, these are the lights that guide us. As we live our days, these are the ways we remember. Tonight we remember with love Carol Oppenheim, mother of Roberta Bamberger, grandmother of Miriam Arrington Fisher, as well as the yahrzeits of Ida Edwards, longtime member of ORME, Lena Feinmel, aunt of Nancy Nelson, Sonny Halperin, aunt of Sue Shires, Jim Harding, brother-in-law of Beth Meixner, Marguerite Hirsch, longtime member of ORME, Harold Horwitz, father of Rita Payton. Con Kent, father of Linda Kessler. Matt Lanke, grandfather of Beth Meixner. Bob Mayers, father of Linda Heiser. Helen Nelson, mother of Nancy Nelson. Leonard Paul, father of Isabel Paul. John Sheehan, uncle of Maggie Foote. Cheryl Tandlich, longtime member of ORME, and Edwin Wires, father of Jeannie Engler. Are there other loved ones you wish to remember tonight? Of course. Zichronam Livracha, may their memories always be a blessing. We remain standing as a community of support for the mourners Kaddish on page 24. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, Be'alma divrach hirute v'amlich malchute, B'chayechon uvyomechon, uvchaye dechol Beit Yisrael, Ba'agala uvizman kari v'imru Amen. Yehe shmei Rabbah mivarach le'olam olomei almaya, Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar v'yitalev v'yithalal shemei dekudesha brichu, le'ela mikol birchata v'shirata, tush bechata v'nechamata, da'amiran be'alma v'imru Amen. Yehe shlama Rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru Amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru Amen. May the source of peace send peace to all who mourn, and may we be a source of comfort for all who are bereaved. And let us say, Amen. Please be seated. We conclude the service portion of our evening with the song on the top of page 25, Lo Yisa Goy. Thank you, Patricia, for playing piano tonight. Tonight it is my honor to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Melissa Kravitz. Dr. Kravitz is an associate professor of history and co-director of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Longwood University. She also teaches K through 12th grade teachers at the Virginia Holocaust Museum's Alexander Liebenstein Teacher Education Institute every summer. Her first book, Women Doctors in Weimar and Nazi Germany, Maternalism, Eugenics, and Professional Identity, was published by the University of Toronto Press in 2019. Her latest work was as the editor of the memoir of Ilse Seger, which she spoke about at the JCC and the local Holocaust Museum earlier this month. Tonight she will be sharing some of the story of Ilse Seger, a non-Jewish woman who resisted the Nazis and was held hostage along with her daughter, Renata. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Melissa Kravitz to share this incredible story. And we'll take just a moment to set up.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you all for having me. Thank you to the rabbi, and thank you to the congregation for inviting me. I feel very, very privileged to be able to publish this memoir at this historical moment, and also to be able to share this story with all of you today. So this memoir came out of my work at the Virginia Holocaust Museum, where I've been teaching every summer. I teach a class on the Holocaust for K through 12 teachers. Dr. Charlie Sidner, who's the former director of the museum and former historian of the museum, started telling me about this memoir back in 2017, and he thought that I should publish it, and he is the first one who put me in touch with the family, Ilsa's grandson and her son-in-law, who was still alive at the time. And I contacted them, and in 2018, I traveled to Terre Haute, Indiana, where her daughter and son-in-law were living at the time or in the same retirement community in the same town as their oldest son, who published the epilogue, or he wrote the epilogue of the book. And I scoured the archives of their family archive, which was the back of their retirement community. Before that, I had also, by the way, received this memoir in a single notepad file. I don't know when the last time anyone's used a notepad file is, so it did not arrive in perfect form. And then when I went to Indiana, the family said to me, well, you should take a lot of these materials home. And so they're now sitting in my hallway closet, not in the most preserved state, and I have had a lot of ethical qualms about what it means to kind of house this family's treasure trove in my hallway closet, not in proper form, and I've been trying to work with the family to get them to donate it to the museum. And I spent and this is also, by the way, what it looks like every time I try to open up these materials. The newspapers are literally falling apart, and this is in my guest room, so I don't actually have proper place to, in fact, house them or open them. And then I spent the next 3 years editing the memoir, so I added a historical introduction with historical context. I divided the notepad file into chapters and added introductions and conclusions to all of the chapters, and then worked with Mark to write an epilogue. And then I got a book contract with Indiana University Press in June of 2022, and went through a peer review process, copy edits, page proofs, and it just came out last month, December 3rd. So publishing takes a very long time, as you can see. So today, really what I want to share with you is a little bit about Ilsa's life, and I also want to talk to you about some of the ways that she became a resistor to authoritarianism, and maybe some of the lessons that we can all take from her memoir for this historical moment. So Ilsa was born in Strasbourg. Her parents, who are pictured here right after her wedding to Gerhard Sieger, were actors, which meant that she moved around a lot. And she was often the mother, so to say, of her two younger brothers, Wolfgang and Joachim. And she was living in Freiburg, Germany, where her family had settled down after the First World War, when Gerhard Heinrich Sieger came. He was giving a lecture there. He was the Secretary General of a German peace organization that had started back in the end of the 19th century, and he was often touring Germany. So they met through friends, they got engaged and married very quickly. And a couple years after they got engaged and married, so this was 1928, in 1930, Gerhard decided to run for office, run for a parliament position in the German Reichstag for the Social Democratic Party. Just to give you a little bit of background on the Social Democratic Party, this is a party that had been founded back in 1863, before Germany was even a nation. It was a party very much made up of leftist workers, and it was a very popular party in German federal elections, especially starting right prior to the First World War. It became the largest party in the Reichstag in 1912, and they played a really fundamental role in the foundation of Germany's first democracy in the aftermath of the First World War. And pictured here is the first president of the Weimar Republic, Friedrich Ebert, who was a member of the Social Democratic Party. And the party, again, has been in Germany for a very long time, and it was very opposed to two new political parties that had emerged in the aftermath of the First World War. The Communist Party, which was also on the left and was also trying to attract workers, and it was very opposed to the new Nazi Party that had emerged in 1919 that was on the very far right. So throughout the 1920s, this party is very much devoted to parliamentary democracy. It's very, very much devoted to the Weimar Republic, and it's opposed to these other parties. The Nazi Party, which is a party that emerges in the aftermath of the First World War, is of course a party that is embracing extreme nationalism, expansionism, racism, anti-Semitism, and is very much fighting against both the new Communist Party and also against this Social Democratic Party, which is basically running the government at the time. So there's these two parties on the left and then this new party on the right. And all the parties basically hate one another. So in 1930, getting back to the election in which Gerhard Sieger decides to run for election, this is an election that's very much influenced by the effects of the Great Depression on Germany. So stock market crash in 1929. This trickles on over into Europe. And about a third of the German working age population becomes unemployed by 1932. I mean, 1930, it was not as many people. It was about 2.5 million people. But then by 1932, there's over 6 million people that become unemployed. So this election in 1930 is a very pivotal election for the Nazi Party. They become the second largest party in the Reichstag at that point. They had only 12 seats prior to that, but they win 107 seats in this election. And then the Communist Party is also winning a lot of seats at this point too. People are basically looking for alternatives to liberal democracy at this point, some sort of solution. Gerhard Sieger also won his seat in the Reichstag as a member of the Social Democratic Party. This is also an election that is called early because the Reichstag was so stagnated at that point. It's very different than our own Congress with only 2 parties. There were 15 parties in the Reichstag at that point, and it was very stagnated, and they couldn't pass any legislation to deal with the Great Depression. So it's called early. And the whole reason that the president has the ability to do this is because in the Weimar Constitution, they had enacted a decree that he would be allowed to rule as a dictator in crises or in the state of emergency. So this is important because the Weimar Republic ceases to be a republic even before Hitler is appointed chancellor. So Gerhard wins his seat, and Ilse talks a lot about this in 1930. This is a big pivotal moment for her family too. And the president continues to call new elections. In fact, he calls 4 more elections between 1930 and 1932 to deal with this kind of economic crisis. And Gerhard continues to run. And so she talks a lot about, in the memoir, how there's this constant cycle of dissolving the Reichstag, him having to campaign, new elections that are affecting their lives. And she's also discussing a lot in the memoir the stronger presence of the Nazi Party, how she sees flags everywhere, how she sees the Nazi paramilitary group, the SA, or colloquially known as the brown shirts, everywhere. And they're often fighting in the streets and in campaign events with the Reichsbanner Schwarz-Rot-Gold, which is the SPD, the Social Democrats paramilitary organization. A lot of people don't know that they have their own paramilitary organization. And there's a lot of violence between these two groups in the streets of Germany. And some of this violence is even targeted at Ilse's family because of the fact that Gerhard was constantly running for re-election. So the Nazi Party was winning more and more seats in the Reichstag, and eventually became the largest party in the Reichstag. And the president decided in 1933 to appoint Hitler chancellor. Excuse me, I'm going to put in a cough drop. Sorry. So the hope was here, and this was the president being able to appoint a chancellor was a right that was written into their Weimar Constitution. And the hope here was that with the Nazi Party being the largest party in the Reichstag, if they appointed Hitler chancellor, the de facto leader of the Reichstag he could get some legislation passed to deal with this unemployment problem and the economic problem. Nobody at the time had any idea what was in store. So about a month after he's appointed chancellor, comes to power legally, there's a fire that breaks out in the Reichstag building. So the Reichstag is not just the parliament system, but there's also a building where I take students with my colleague, Professor Rice here, who's joining us tonight. We take students there every May, so we're taking them to visit the Reichstag this year. So this is a building, the fire breaks out. To this day, historians still debate who started the fire. There's still, and you know, the documents that come out of it are very biased. There's actually a communist who's put on trial, but these are all very biased documents because of the fact that the Nazi Party is running Germany. So the Nazis blame the communists for doing this, the party that they hated, and Hitler, the chancellor, convinces the president to pass a decree, another emergency decree, that's again written into the Weimar Constitution to say that there is a purported communist uprising in Germany, and so they strip people of their civil liberties, and it also gives the police the ability to arrest and detain people much easier. So the decree is very significant for Ilse's life. Ilse writes about how she is actually witness to, or she hears about the fire, and then she's witness to several of Gerhardt's friends and colleagues getting arrested, and many of these people are also trying to convince him to leave the country. There was also an election that was happening a week after this fire. Hitler had called the election upon becoming chancellor because he was trying to win more seats in the Reichstag. So the election goes on. Gerhardt, her husband, still runs for the Reichstag position. He wins, but many of his colleagues had already been arrested or left the country in even just the week between the fire and the election. So Gerhardt wins the election, and a week later, Ilse convinces him to leave Dessau, where they were living, and he goes to the city of Leipzig because he's trying to basically get into hiding. And even though he leaves his hometown, he still gets arrested by some local Dessau police and by some members of the SA. So several dozen members of the Reichstag who were part of the Social Democrats get arrested, and every single member who was a communist who was part of the Reichstag gets arrested. So her husband is held in a local prison in Dessau, Germany for 3 months. And Ilse writes about visiting him there. She's able to visit him actually once a week and at certain times every other day. So he's held in this prison, and then in June, he suddenly moved to one of the first concentration camps in Germany known as Oranienburg. Oranienburg is right outside Berlin. It's in the town of Oranienburg. The location of it also becomes the location of a much more famous concentration camp known as Sachsenhausen that you can also visit today. So he spent 6 months living there, and Ilse gives us insight in what it was like to try to visit someone in early concentration camp. Visiting hours were very arbitrary. There would be lengthy bans on visitors. The visits would be closely monitored. And Ilse is also, as she's visiting her husband in this concentration camp, she's also witness to the actions of the Nazi Party in the early months in what is known as the Nazi Revolution because of how quick the takeover is. So early actions like the book burning that happens in May that is primarily led by students, and it happens not only in Berlin, but it happens all over Germany and Austria. She's also witnessed and participates, not in the boycott, but participates in a moment of resistance during the April 1st boycott of Jewish businesses and shops that was called by the Nazis. She participates in an act of resistance in which she walks into a Jewish department store and buys a curtain rod, something that she doesn't need, just to show solidarity with Jews on this day, largely because she knew the sales ladies and she did not like the regime. After all, they had arrested her husband. So these small acts of resistance lead to an even larger act of resistance in which she smuggles money into Oranienburg on her last visit to see her husband. And a lot of what we know after that happens actually we know from his book. He wrote a book about his experience in Oranienburg because he escaped in December of 1933. So this was after spending 6 months there, after basically claiming in this book that he had a choice between suicide or escape, and he decided to escape. And Gerhardt managed to escape because of the fact that these early concentration camps are very different than what you might imagine of a concentration camp. In fact, they're known as wild camps. They're basically any buildings that the Nazis can get their hands on. They really have very little infrastructure. They didn't have things, for example, like guard towers or barbed wire. And Gerhardt, or barracks even, Gerhardt was also wearing his own clothes, so he wasn't even wearing a uniform. So this is something that made it easier for him to escape. He was also not completely secluded from society. He was working, performing hard labor, which meant that escaping was a little bit easier. So very early one morning, as he was performing hard labor, he used an embankment that he had created from the work that they were doing to hide himself, to cover, and then he ran through an open field. Neither the SA guards or the other prisoners saw him, and he went to a restaurant in a nearby town because, again, they weren't secluded from society. And he called a taxi, and he traveled via taxi and tram, a train and streetcar through Berlin, even stopping to get his first warm bath in 9 months, and generally stayed away from the center of town, using more regional trains that weren't as closely monitored. And then he actually walked 8 hours through the mountains over the border to Prague in below freezing temperature. And I have a map here. You can see where Oranienburg is located and where Prague is located on the map in the Czech Republic, now the Czech Republic. So the entire escape took him about 22 hours. So Ilse saw Gerhardt for the last time. She brought him the money, and she went back to her hometown. She didn't know anything that had happened. Excuse me. And almost immediately, 2 men show up at her house. And they informed her that her husband had escaped. And she discussed the uncertainty of this time, not knowing whether or not he had survived or not. And the guards who showed up at her house said, "We're going to have to stay here, and you're going to be under house arrest." So she is kept under house arrest, and she had absolutely no information about where her husband was and no information about why she was even being kept under house arrest. So this happens for 3 days, and on the 4th day, her mother-in-law shows up. She concocts a plan, another form of resistance, to meet with her mother-in-law to talk to her about what she knows, and her mother-in-law reveals to her that her husband has made it to Prague with the help of an underground social democrat network. Ilse and her daughter, though, I forgot to mention, by the way, that they had had a daughter in 1929, so her daughter's about 17 months old at this point. They had to remain at home and under house arrest. And once the police got word that Gerhardt made it back to Prague, Ilse had already known this, they let her go. And she actually, during this time, debated escaping to Prague herself, but it was a bit uncertain, right? She would put her entire family at risk, her parents, her daughter, herself, but she also really wanted to see her husband again. So shortly after she's let out of house arrest, the police commissioner of Dessau shows up and tells her that she's going to have to be detained in a new concentration camp that has opened in Roslau. So Roslau is a concentration camp that was another one of these wild camps. It had been property that had been confiscated by the Social Democratic Party. And she moves to Roslau, and in fact, her chapter that she wrote on Roslau is one of the very few detailed descriptions that historians have of this concentration camp, because it eventually closed and we have very little information about it. In fact, even no pictures of it, only this ink drawing that was made. And she gives us a lot of information about the camp, how there's a fluctuation of prisoners in and out of the camp, some staying only a few days, some staying for a longer time. We know that at least 40 of the prisoners came from Oranienburg and knew her husband in Oranienburg. She never encountered any Jews in the camp. All of the prisoners in the camp were Social Democrats and communists, and these were the first people who were imprisoned by the Nazis. We also get a sense of how her life differed from the other prisoners in the camp. So she enjoyed certain privileges while being in Roßlau. She was permitted liberties, probably because of her status as a woman and a mother, but also as her status as a hostage. She was not being held as a prisoner, but as a hostage to try and goad her husband back to Germany. So for example, she was able to demand certain things for her daughter. She demanded that her daughter's crib be brought to this concentration camp, which obviously would seem very out of place. She was also able to use the commandant's private toilet, the one that no one else was able to use. She was able to buy things that her daughter might need to eat. And one privilege she enjoyed almost daily was leaving the camp and going out for walks in the town. She would go to the park, the library, stores. And again, this is likely due to her status as a hostage. And she actually befriended one of the SS officers who was monitoring her, who only said he joined the SS, the party's paramilitary organization, because he needed work after the Depression. And she often experiences sympathy from others who, when she's out shopping in Roßlau, they'll leave gifts for her in her daughter's carriage, or kind of secretly give her gifts. So Ilse spends 4 months in Roßlau with her daughter. They're the only women in the camp, women and daughter, and then they're unexpectedly released. And this all came about because of Gerhardt's connections through the Social Democratic Party, and also because he had published that book in 1934 when he was living in exile in Prague. It was translated into several languages almost immediately because it's one of the first portrayals of a concentration camp, early concentration camp. And he's invited on many speaking tours. So one of the places he's invited on a speaking tour is to Parliament in England. And so some members of Parliament helped facilitate Ilse and Renata's release. This was also a time in which the Germans were trying to angle to get an Anglo-German partnership, if you will, and they recognized that the Nazis would be very concerned if English public opinion was not good of them. So the members of Parliament this international political situation really played a role in helping Ilse and Renata get released. So once they get released, she's visited in Dessau by a member of Parliament, and she basically has to make the decision to leave Germany right away if she wants to see her husband again. So they facilitate her release from Germany. She leaves without seeing or telling her parents. She has to say goodbye to her best friend. This is also a place that she still very much feels like is her home, so it's very difficult for her to leave. And she's reunited with her husband in May of 1934, about a week after she's released from Roßlau. This is a huge press event, and they spend a week in London with a bunch of members of Parliament. And then Gerhardt gets invited on another speaking tour in Norway, and then he gets invited to a speaking in the United States. And she doesn't yet have the ability to travel to the United States, so they have to decide where she's going to live in exile. So she spends some time living in exile in France and then eventually in Switzerland with her daughter. And her husband, meanwhile, is basically on a speaking tour of the United States, in what we would call an anti-fascist speaking tour of the United States in 1934 and 1935. The entire time she's living in exile, she also is witnessing some of the other things going on. And she's very hopeful that either the German military or people will stand up to Hitler. And this is not the case at all. Eventually, Gerhardt returns they get a visa for her, and she's able to be reunited with Gerhard, who's gone back to the United States to start working in New York for a German language newspaper. And she's able to move in December of 1935 to New York. So they immigrate to New York. Renata grew up in New York City. She went to Queens College, where she met her future husband, Richard Brandt, who was the one that I was put in touch with back in 2017. They were married at Gerhard and Ilse's house. And then Richard and Renata were employed in New York, and then Richard went on to get an MS in chemistry and a PhD in biochemistry. They had 3 children between 1960 and 1965. Mark, the oldest one, is the one who I've been working with the most to publish the memoir. And sadly, Gerhard died in 1967. And then in 1970, Richard, Ilse's son-in-law, got offered a job at MCV, and they ended up here in Richmond. And this is how they ended up in Richmond. And Ilse was left behind in New York by herself, without her family, without her grandchildren. And this is right at the moment when her daughter convinces her to write the memoir. And Richard Brandt worked for MCV for 27 years. Renata worked as a school librarian. Ilse, by the way, died in 1979 at the age of 76. She only lived in Richmond for about a year when she finally was convinced to move down here. Renata worked as a school librarian for Obama Elementary School, which, of course, went through a name change back in 2020. Richard and Renata moved to Indiana in 2016. I got to meet them in 2018 when I visited there. And unfortunately, both of them died during COVID in 2020 and 2021. And I am actually going to Mexico in March to meet Jennifer, the granddaughter of Ilse, and I'll be meeting her where she works, and also doing some book talks there. Lastly, I just wanted to say a few things about Ilse as a resistor. I do talk about how this memoir kind of fell into my lap, but I also would like to think that I took a lot of agency in highlighting this part of her identity. I don't know if Ilse would have said that she was a resistor. She certainly never expected her husband to get arrested simply because of his political views. She certainly never expected to end up in the out group herself, and let alone in a concentration camp with her 17-month-old daughter. At times, though, she did recognize that she was resisting. So she would meet with other members of the Social Democratic Party and talk against the regime. And I do think that this simple act of discussing the new Nazi regime, discussing things like the Reichstag fire, civil discourse, if you will, is kind of a core tenet of democracy, and something that we can remember when we're thinking about ways to resist dictatorship. Also, this moment of going into the Jewish department store, I mean, this is a form of economic resistance. We all also have the ability to choose how and where we spend our money. And I think that this is something that we can also learn from Ilse as well. Of course, if you are fortunate enough to have the means. And then I think lastly, I mean, she's constantly showing sympathy with the persecuted group, with Jews, with other communists. Eventually, the communists and the Social Democrats form a lot of camaraderie in Roßlau when they're all together. And she, recognized the great risk that people were also taking by showing camaraderie with her, by leaving her small gifts when she was out walking in Roßlau. So I think she teaches us that it's always really important to show sympathy and solidarity for the persecuted group, because you never know when you can become the persecuted group. So I think Ilse's resistance shows us that there's a broad definition of resistance, that even small, subtle, domestic acts of resistance are very important. Many of her acts were antithetical to the culture that the Nazis were trying to create, a culture of isolation, of denunciation. So she's certainly been an inspiration to me, and hopefully she can be to all of you. She does give me a lot of hope about what ordinary people will do in the face of rising authoritarianism. And I hope we can remember this in the future months. Thank you very much. you want me to take questions? Okay. I'll also be in the back if you feel like a more private question. Yeah, Jeff?
Were you familiar with their story before meeting Grant? And after you got through with this project, what was the most surprising thing about her story?
So I was not familiar at all. Gerhardt's book is pretty famous. Yeah, also, I mean, it's pretty famous. It's published in several languages. In fact, if you want to read it in English, it's called A Nation Terrorized. I mean, it's famous kind of on the political left, if you will. So I was not familiar with their story. I think most surprising to me is the way that this uneducated woman is able to live in exile, is able to really make a living for herself without kind of the support. I mean, her husband's gone for most of the time, and she's able to kind of live and make a living for herself and really persevere, if you will, as a single mom, essentially, because her husband was in a camp and then in exile and then in the United States. And she teaches herself English. I mean, the memoir is actually typed in that notepad file in English. So I think that's really impressive, like just to teach yourself English, to live in exile, I think is a very difficult thing as well. So I think that's probably the thing that's most surprising to me is
even though she might have considered herself a resistor, she obviously is a woman of very, very moral personality, and I think that's probably what drove her in her decision.
sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think certainly, I think a lot of influence came from her parents and her brothers as well. I mean, she talks about this a bit. And I think she, you know, becomes very political, even more political than she would have been because of her husband and his position in the Reichstag. Her husband's father was also in the Reichstag, so they had a long history of being in the Social Democratic Party. Yeah. That's a good question. She doesn't speak a lot about that. She doesn't, in fact, talk about being religious when she's in Germany, when she's living in exile, or living in the United States. I do know that, of course, her husband was running this German language newspaper in New York, and in fact, in the same neighborhood, you had the American Fascist Party living there, and there's a lot of confrontation between the two groups. He speaks in front of quite a few religious groups on his speaking tour. I have, in fact, the letters they exchange when he's living in the United States and she's living in Switzerland. But again, I think that that's more of an invitation of people who would show sympathy with his cause. Well, thank you all for having me. I appreciate it. Also, I wanted to mention that I'll be in the back. I do have books if you want to buy them. I know some people don't like to read physical books, so if you want to buy an e-book, that's also a thing you can do too. Thank you. They can, yeah. And I promote buying it from the publisher in a form of where you choose to spend your money. Economic resistance.
So thank you again for a wonderful presentation. And as she mentioned, if anyone would like to get a copy of the book, there's a few copies available to support local authors and scholars. And as we clean up from the service, I invite you to bring your service to the table near the entrance. But before you do, Ron has one quick announcement sort of related to this historical period in the movie.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that the movie this month is going to be on the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a Lutheran pastor in Nazi Germany, who was one of the people who spoke up. And his mentor was Martin Niemöller, who is famous for the statement, At first, they came for the trade unionist, but I was not a trade unionist but didn't speak up. Next, they came for the socialist, but I was not a socialist, so I didn't speak up. Next, they came for the communist, but I was not a communist, so I didn't speak up. Next, they came for the Jews, but I wasn't Jewish, so I didn't speak up. And finally, they came for me, but there was no one to speak up. And there's also, so I'll be showing that movie on, I think it's February 16th. And it's a very powerful movie. There's a new movie on Bonhoeffer that played in theaters around Christmas time. I saw that movie, and it's far inferior to the 1985 movie. I think it's 1985 that I will be showing. And also there's another movie that I saw last weekend in Williamsburg called Resistance. They Fought Back, which details contrary evidence to the thought that all Jews were just led to the slaughter like lambs. That's not really true. There was a lot of resistance, and the first means of resistance was just the one that our speaker mentioned. And in the film, they called that Amidah, standing silent resistance in your purchases, in your speaking out, things like that. So come to the movie if you're interested in the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was one of the most inspiring people in the 20th century.
Okay. So now please return your service handouts to the table and join us in the back for Kiddush and Motzi.